The morning sun had barely crested the palace walls when Thomas arrived for his shift at the east entrance. He had been working as a royal guard for nearly 15 years, and in all that time he had never imagined that a single moment would change everything. The stone corridors echoed with the familiar sounds of the palace awakening, servants rushing to prepare breakfast, and courtiers beginning their daily routines. Thomas stood at his post, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture straight and unwavering. He took pride in his work, knowing that his dedication had earned him the respect of his fellow guards and the trust of the royal family. Queen Camilla had been particularly demanding lately. The staff whispered about her changing moods, the way she would snap at servants over minor infractions, and her increasingly rigid expectations for palace protocol. Some said the pressure of royal life had gotten to her, while others believed she was simply asserting her authority after years of living in someone else's shadow. Thomas had witnessed several incidents where she had publicly reprimanded staff members, her voice sharp and cutting, leaving them trembling in her wake. He had always maintained his professional composure during these episodes, grateful that her attention had never turned directly toward him. That particular morning, Thomas noticed unusual activity near the throne room. Extra guards had been positioned at every doorway, and palace officials moved with an urgency that suggested something important was about to happen. He learned from his colleague Marcus that a formal ceremony was scheduled for later that day, one that would involve several foreign dignitaries and members of the press. The Queen had apparently insisted on inspecting every detail personally, from the flower arrangements to the positioning of each guard. Thomas felt a knot forming in his stomach, knowing that such occasions often brought out the worst of Camilla's perfectionism. Around mid-morning, the head of palace security, Captain Reynolds, called all guards to attention. He walked down the line, inspecting each uniform with a critical eye, adjusting medals and straightening collars. When he reached Thomas, he paused for a moment, examining his uniform from head to toe. Thomas held his breath, but Reynolds simply nodded with approval before moving on. The captain's expression was tense, and he reminded everyone that the Queen expected absolute perfection today. Any mistakes would reflect poorly not just on the individual guard, but on the entire security detail. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The hours passed slowly as Thomas maintained his position. His legs began to ache, but he refused to shift his weight or show any sign of discomfort. This was part of the job, part of the discipline that separated royal guards from ordinary security personnel. He watched as decorators added final touches to the throne room, saw kitchen staff carrying elaborate dishes toward the banquet hall, and observed palace officials rushing back and forth with clipboards and worried expressions. The entire palace seemed to pulse with nervous energy, everyone aware that the Queen would tolerate nothing less than perfection. It was just after noon when Queen Camilla emerged from her private chambers. She wore a stunning powder blue ensemble, her jewelry catching the light from the palace chandeliers. Her face was composed, almost serene. But Thomas had learned to recognize the tension in her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes that warned of her mood. She moved through the corridor with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Several attendants followed at a respectful distance, ready to respond to her every need. Thomas straightened even more, if that were possible, as she approached his section of the corridor. The Queen paused near the throne room entrance, surveying everything with a critical gaze. She pointed out a flower arrangement that was slightly off-center, and a servant rushed to correct it. She commented on the temperature of the room, and someone immediately adjusted the climate control. Every word she spoke sent people scurrying to fulfill her wishes. Thomas remained absolutely still, hoping to avoid her attention. He had seen what happened to those who disappointed her, and he had no desire to become the target of her displeasure. Then, unexpectedly, Camilla turned toward him. Her eyes swept over his uniform, taking in every detail. Thomas felt his heart rate increase, though his expression remained neutral. She took a step closer, her gaze intense and searching. For a moment he thought she might simply move on, but instead she stopped directly in front of him. The corridor seemed to fall silent, other staff members freezing in place, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Thomas could hear his own breathing, careful and controlled, as he waited for whatever came next. The Queen's voice, when she finally spoke, was cold and measured. She told him that his boots were not polished to the standard she expected from royal guards. Thomas felt a flash of confusion because he had spent extra time that morning ensuring his boots gleamed. He glanced down briefly and saw his reflection in the highly polished leather. Before he could respond, Camilla continued, her tone growing sharper. She said that such carelessness was unacceptable, especially on a day when the palace would be hosting important guests. She declared that he was setting a poor example for the other guards. Then came the command that would change everything. Queen Camilla, standing before Thomas with the full weight of her royal authority, pointed to the marble floor and ordered him to kneel. She wanted him to kneel right there in the corridor, in front of all the other staff members as punishment for his supposed failure. The demand hung in the air like a physical presence. Thomas felt dozens of eyes on him, felt the weight of expectation and tradition pressing down. This was the moment when everything he believed about duty, respect, and human dignity collided. This was the moment when Thomas had to make a choice that would alter the course of his life and send shockwaves through the entire palace. Time seemed to slow down as Thomas stood before Queen Camilla, her command still echoing in the marble corridor. The other guards shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Thomas and the Queen. Palace servants had stopped their work completely, frozen in place by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. Thomas could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, could hear the blood rushing in his ears. 15 years of service, 15 years of unwavering loyalty, and it had come down to this single moment. He looked at the Queen, really looked at her, and saw not just the crown and the authority, but something else in her eyes that he could not quite name. Thomas had always been a man who valued his principles. His father, a factory worker who had struggled to provide for his family, had taught him that dignity was something no one could take from you, unless you surrendered it yourself. His mother had shown him through her own example that kindness and strength were not opposites but partners. These lessons had shaped Thomas into the man he was today, a man who treated everyone with respect regardless of their station, a man who believed that true nobility came from character rather than title. Standing there in that corridor, he realized that kneeling would not just be an act of obedience. It would be a betrayal of everything his parents had taught him. The Queen's expression hardened as the seconds ticked by without Thomas moving. She repeated her command, her voice louder now, more insistent. She reminded him that she was his queen, that his refusal to obey was tantamount to treason. The word hung heavy in the air, carrying with it the weight of potential consequences. Thomas knew that disobeying a direct order from royalty could cost him his position, his livelihood, perhaps even his freedom. He thought about his small apartment, his modest savings, the simple life he had built through years of honest work. All of it could disappear because of what he was about to do. Then Thomas did something that no one expected. He spoke. His voice was calm and steady, without a trace of anger or defiance, but filled with quiet conviction. He told the Queen that he had served the royal family faithfully for 15 years, that he had never shirked his duty or compromised his post. He explained that his boots had been polished to the highest standard that morning, as they were every morning, and that he had done nothing to warrant public humiliation. Then he said the words that would echo through the palace for days to come. He told her that while he respected her position and authority, he could not and would not kneel, because to do so would be to accept a punishment he did not deserve. The corridor erupted in gasps and whispers. Some staff members looked horrified, others stunned. Captain Reynolds moved forward as if to intervene, but something in Thomas's demeanor stopped him. The Queen's face flushed red, her composure cracking for the first time. She appeared genuinely shocked that someone had dared to refuse her so directly. For years, everyone in the palace had scrambled to fulfill her every wish, had bent over backwards to avoid her displeasure. No one had ever stood up to her like this, especially not in front of witnesses. The power dynamic that had seemed so absolute moments before suddenly appeared fragile, uncertain. Thomas continued speaking, his words measured but firm. He told the Queen that respect must flow both ways, that a title did not give anyone the right to humiliate another person without cause. He acknowledged that she held power over his employment, over his future, but that she did not hold power over his conscience or his dignity. He said these things not with anger, but with a sadness that seemed to come from a deep place within him, as if he mourned the necessity of this confrontation. His fellow guards stared at him with a mixture of admiration and fear, knowing that his career was likely over but unable to deny the truth in his words. Queen Camilla opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She looked around at the assembled staff, seeing their faces, reading the emotions there. Some looked frightened, yes, but others showed something different. There was a spark of recognition in their eyes, as if Thomas had given voice to feelings they had long suppressed. The Queen suddenly seemed to realize that she was not just facing one rebellious guard, but a moment that could define her entire reign. How she responded now would tell everyone in the palace, and eventually everyone in the kingdom, what kind of monarch she truly was. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. Palace staff who had been going about their duties now pressed closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. Word was already spreading through the corridors, servants whispering to each other, guards exchanging significant glances. In the modern age of smartphones and social media, Thomas knew that this confrontation would not remain private for long. Someone would talk, word would leak out, and then the whole world would be watching to see what happened next. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange sense of peace. He had spoken his truth, and whatever came next, he would face it with his integrity intact. Captain Reynolds finally found his voice and suggested that perhaps everyone should return to their duties, that this matter could be discussed privately later. But the Queen held up her hand, silencing him. She was still staring at Thomas, her expression unreadable now. Something was happening behind her eyes, some internal calculation or realization. Thomas met her gaze steadily, not with defiance but with dignity. He was a man who had done his job well for 15 years, who had harmed no one, who simply refused to be broken for no reason. In that moment he represented something larger than himself, something that even the Queen could not ignore. What Queen Camilla said next surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. Her voice when it came was different from before, softer but no less powerful. She told Thomas that she would consider his words carefully, that perhaps she had been too hasty in her judgment. She did not apologize, not exactly, but there was something in her tone that acknowledged the validity of his stance. Then she turned and walked away, her attendants scrambling to follow. The corridor remained silent for several long moments after she disappeared from view. Thomas felt his knees go weak, the adrenaline that had sustained him suddenly draining away. He had survived the confrontation, but he knew the real consequences were yet to come. The rest of that day passed in a strange fog for Thomas. He remained at his post, maintaining his professional demeanor, but he could feel the eyes of everyone in the palace on him. Guards who had been his colleagues for years now looked at him with a mixture of respect and concern. Some approached him during breaks, quietly expressing their support, while others kept their distance, perhaps afraid that association with him might taint their own standing. The palace servants whispered constantly, and Thomas caught fragments of conversations as they passed. Some called him brave, others called him foolish, but everyone agreed that nothing like this had ever happened before. Captain Reynolds summoned Thomas to his office an hour before the end of his shift. The walk through the palace corridors felt longer than usual, each step heavy with anticipation. Thomas prepared himself for the worst, expecting to be dismissed immediately, possibly even escorted from the premises. When he entered the office, Reynolds was standing by the window, his back turned, hands clasped behind him. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes before the captain finally spoke. He asked Thomas if he realized what he had done, the potential consequences of his actions. Thomas replied honestly that he did, but that he would make the same choice again if faced with the same situation. Reynolds turned around, and Thomas was surprised to see something almost like admiration in his eyes. The captain explained that he had been torn between his duty to maintain order and his recognition that Thomas had been treated unfairly. He admitted that the Queen's behavior had been troubling him for months, that several good staff members had quietly left the palace because they could no longer tolerate the constant criticism and arbitrary demands. Reynolds said that someone needed to stand up to her, but he had never imagined it would happen the way it did. He told Thomas that for now, he should continue his duties as normal, but that the situation remained uncertain and could change at any moment. That evening, as Thomas returned to his small apartment, he found several messages waiting for him. Some were from fellow guards offering support, others from family members who had somehow already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in the age of social media, and though no official statement had been released, rumors were already spreading beyond the palace walls. Thomas sat in his modest living room, surrounded by the simple furnishings he had accumulated over the years, and wondered if he had just thrown away everything he had worked for. He thought about his late parents, wondered what they would think of his decision. He hoped they would be proud, but he could not be certain. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Queen Camilla was experiencing her own turmoil. She had retreated to her private chambers, dismissing even her closest attendants. For the first time in years, she was alone with her thoughts, forced to confront what had happened that morning. The confrontation with Thomas had shaken something loose inside her, exposing feelings and doubts she had long suppressed. She thought about the path that had led her to this moment, the years of scrutiny and criticism, the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of her position. Somewhere along the way she realized she had confused strength with hardness, authority with cruelty. The queen stood before her mirror, studying her reflection. She saw a woman draped in expensive clothes and precious jewelry, a woman who commanded respect through fear rather than love. When had she become this person? She remembered her younger self, full of ideals about service and duty, about using her position to make a positive difference in people's lives. But the weight of expectation, the endless criticism from the press, the feeling of never being quite good enough had gradually hardened her heart. She had built walls around herself and, in doing so, had lost touch with the very people she was meant to serve. Over the next few days, the tension in the palace remained high. Thomas continued to report for duty, though he half expected each shift to be his last. The other guards treated him with a new kind of respect, but there was also wariness. They knew that standing with him might mean risking their own positions. The servants continued their whispered conversations, and Thomas noticed that some of them seemed to stand a little straighter when they passed him, as if his example had given them permission to reclaim their own dignity. The incident had created invisible fault lines throughout the palace hierarchy, forcing everyone to consider where they stood. On the third day after the confrontation, something unexpected happened. A formal announcement was made that Queen Camilla would be addressing all palace staff the following morning. The news sent ripples of speculation through every corridor and chamber. Some believed she would use the opportunity to make an example of Thomas, to reassert her authority and demonstrate that defiance would not be tolerated. Others hoped that perhaps something more positive might emerge, though they dared not voice this hope too loudly. Thomas himself felt his stomach knot with anxiety. Whatever was coming, he knew it would determine not just his own fate, but possibly set the tone for how the palace operated for years to come. The night before the address, Thomas barely slept. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, running through possible scenarios in his mind. Would he be publicly dismissed? Would there be consequences beyond just losing his job? He thought about his options if the worst happened. He had some savings, and his work record up until this incident was exemplary. Finding new employment might not be impossible, though few jobs could match the prestige and security of a royal guard position. But more than his own future, Thomas worried about what his stand had meant for others in the palace. Had he helped them, or had he simply made their lives more difficult? The morning of the address arrived gray and overcast, the weather seeming to mirror the uncertain mood within the palace. All staff members who could be spared from essential duties were assembled in the Great Hall, guards and servants standing together in a way they rarely did. Thomas positioned himself near the back, not wanting to draw attention, but several colleagues insisted he stand closer to the front. The hall slowly filled with people, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Then, precisely at the appointed hour, the doors at the far end of the hall opened and Queen Camilla entered. Her expression was composed, but there was something different about her bearing, something that Thomas could not quite identify. The moment of truth had arrived. Queen Camilla walked to the center of the great hall with measured steps, her eyes sweeping across the assembled staff. The silence was absolute, every person holding their breath, waiting to hear what she would say. Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest, his hands clenched at his sides. The queen stood there for a long moment, seeming to gather her thoughts, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried clearly through the vast space. She began by acknowledging that the events of the previous week had given her much to reflect upon, that a moment of confrontation had forced her to examine her own conduct and the culture she had helped create within the palace walls. What came next shocked everyone in the hall. The queen admitted that she had been wrong, The words hung in the air so unexpected that several people gasped audibly. She explained that the pressures of her position had led her to adopt behaviors that were neither kind nor just, that she had confused authority with the right to diminish others. She acknowledged that her demand for Thomas to kneel had been inappropriate and unfair, motivated by her own insecurities rather than any legitimate concern about his performance. She said that in 15 years of service, Thomas had never given her reason to doubt his dedication or professionalism, and that his refusal to accept unjust treatment had shown more courage than she had demonstrated in years. Thomas felt tears pricking his eyes, though he fought to maintain his composure. Around him, other staff members were equally moved, some openly crying, others standing in stunned silence. The Queen continued, addressing not just Thomas but all the palace staff. She spoke about the importance of mutual respect, about how every person who worked in the palace, regardless of their role, deserved to be treated with dignity. She announced that she would be implementing new policies to ensure fair treatment of all employees, including regular meetings where staff could voice concerns without fear of retribution. She promised to work on being not just a figurehead but a leader who earned respect through her actions rather than demanding it through her position. Then Queen Camilla did something that would be remembered for generations. She walked directly to where Thomas stood and extended her hand to him. Not as a queen to her subject, but as one human being to another, acknowledging a wrong and seeking to make it right. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before accepting her handshake. The physical gesture might have been simple, but its meaning resonated throughout the hall and eventually throughout the entire kingdom. It was an acknowledgement that power without responsibility was tyranny, that true leadership required humility, and that sometimes the greatest strength lay in admitting weakness. The Queen asked Thomas if he would be willing to serve on a new committee she was forming, one dedicated to improving working conditions and communication within the palace. She said that she needed people who had the courage to speak truth to power, who would not simply tell her what she wanted to hear. Thomas, still processing everything that had happened, accepted the role. He understood that this was an opportunity not just for himself, but for all the people who worked in the palace, many of whom had suffered in silence for far too long. The other staff members burst into applause, the sound echoing off the ancient walls, a celebration of a new beginning. In the days that followed, the transformation within the palace was remarkable. The Queen made good on her promises, instituting regular staff meetings where concerns could be raised openly. She began walking through the palace more frequently, not to inspect and criticize, but to actually engage with the people who kept the institution running. Servants who had previously cowered in her presence found themselves able to smile and greet her naturally. Guards stood straighter, not from fear, but from renewed pride in their work. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension and anxiety to something warmer, more human. Word of these changes spread beyond the palace walls, and public opinion, which had often been critical of the Queen, began to shift. Thomas found his new role both challenging and rewarding. The committee met weekly, bringing together representatives from every department within the palace. They discussed everything from working hours to conflict resolution procedures, from healthcare benefits to opportunities for advancement. Thomas discovered that many staff members had valuable insights and suggestions that had never been heard simply because no one had created a space for their voices. He worked closely with Captain Reynolds, who had become an ally in the effort to create lasting change. Together, they developed new training programs that emphasized respect and professionalism alongside traditional skills. The Queen herself seemed transformed by the experience. People who had known her for years commented on the change in her demeanor. She smiled more easily, laughed more freely, and seemed genuinely interested in the lives of those around her. She began hosting informal gatherings where staff from different departments could mingle and share their experiences. She learned the names of servants she had previously ignored, asked about their families, remembered details from previous conversations. It was as if the confrontation with Thomas had broken through a shell she had built around herself, allowing her natural warmth and humanity to emerge. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some of the older courtiers grumbled about the erosion of tradition and proper hierarchy. A few staff members who had thrived under the previous system of favoritism found themselves uncomfortable with the new emphasis on fairness and transparency. But these voices of resistance were overwhelmed by the wave of positive energy flowing through the palace. People worked with renewed enthusiasm, knowing that their contributions were valued and their concerns would be heard. Productivity increased, sick days decreased, and the palace began to function with an efficiency it had not experienced in years. Thomas often reflected on that pivotal morning when he had refused to kneel. He understood now that his decision had been about more than just his own dignity. It had been a catalyst for change that was desperately needed, a moment that had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power and respect. He had not set out to become a hero or a symbol, but circumstances had thrust him into that role. What mattered now was ensuring that the changes they had begun would last, that they would become embedded in the culture of the palace so deeply that no future monarch could easily undo them. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid for something better, something more humane. 6 months after the confrontation, the palace had become almost unrecognizable to those who had known it in its darker days. The changes that had begun with Queen Camilla's public apology had rippled outward, touching every aspect of palace life. The new committee that Thomas served on had successfully implemented dozens of improvements, from better working conditions to clearer paths for advancement. Young people from diverse backgrounds were now applying to work at the palace in record numbers, drawn by its reputation as a place that valued merit and treated people fairly. The transformation had captured the public imagination, and the Queen's approval ratings had soared to heights not seen in decades. Thomas had become something of a celebrity, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention. News outlets had picked up the story of the guard who stood up to the Queen, and requests for interviews poured in daily. Thomas declined most of them, believing that the focus should remain on the systemic changes rather than on him personally. When he did agree to speak publicly, he was careful to emphasize that he had not acted alone, that many people within the palace had contributed to the transformation. He spoke about his fellow guards, the hardworking servants, the dedicated administrators who had embraced the new culture of respect and collaboration. He wanted the world to understand that real change required collective effort, not just individual courage. The relationship between Thomas and Queen Camilla had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. They met regularly as part of the committee work, and over time a genuine mutual respect had developed. The Queen often sought his opinion on matters beyond just staff relations, valuing his perspective as someone who understood both the palace hierarchy and the lives of ordinary people. Thomas, in turn, came to appreciate the enormous pressures the Queen faced, the impossible expectations placed upon her, the way every word and action was scrutinized and judged. He saw her not just as a monarch but as a human being trying to navigate an impossibly difficult role. One afternoon, the Queen invited Thomas to have tea in her private study, away from the formal committee meetings and official business. As they sat together in the comfortable room lined with books, she opened up to him in a way she had with few others. She talked about the loneliness of her position, the feeling of being constantly watched and judged, never quite knowing who truly supported her and who simply feared her. She admitted that her harsh behavior had been in part a defense mechanism, a way to maintain control when she felt everything slipping away. Thomas listened without judgment, understanding that vulnerability from someone in such a powerful position required tremendous courage. Thomas shared his own story more fully than he had before, talking about his parents and the values they had instilled in him, about his early days as a guard when everything had seemed so straightforward. He explained that his refusal to kneel had not been planned or calculated, but simply a moment when his conscience would not allow him to do otherwise. He told her that he had been terrified of the consequences, but more afraid of what he would become if he betrayed his own principles. The Queen nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. They both realized that they had been trapped by their roles, by expectations and fears, until circumstances forced them to break free. The positive changes within the palace began to influence the broader institution of the monarchy itself. Other royal households took notice of what was happening, and several reached out to learn about the reforms being implemented. Queen Camilla found herself in the unusual position of being seen as an innovator, someone who was modernizing the monarchy without abandoning its core purposes. She gave speeches about the importance of servant leadership, about using power to lift others rather than to dominate them. Her words resonated with people far beyond the palace walls, particularly younger generations who had been skeptical of the monarchy's relevance in the modern world. Not all the challenges had been overcome. There were still moments of tension, disagreements about policy, resistance from those who preferred the old ways. The committee faced difficult questions about how to balance tradition with progress, how to maintain the dignity of the monarchy while making it more accessible and humane. Thomas found himself mediating disputes, helping people find common ground, always trying to keep the focus on the ultimate goal of creating a workplace where everyone could thrive. He discovered leadership skills he had not known he possessed, an ability to bring people together and forge consensus even on contentious issues. The story of Thomas and the Queen began to take on a life of its own, spreading far beyond their original intention. Teachers used it in classrooms to discuss courage and integrity. Business leaders referenced it in seminars about ethical leadership. The confrontation in the corridor had become a parable about standing up for what is right, about the power of honest communication, about how even the most entrenched systems can change when people refuse to accept injustice. Thomas received letters from people all over the world, sharing their own stories of standing up to unfairness, thanking him for inspiring them to find their voice. He kept every letter, humbled by the impact his actions had generated. As the months passed, Thomas began to think about the future. He was now in his early 40s, and while he loved his work with the committee, he wondered what would come next. Captain Reynolds had suggested that Thomas might consider training new guards, passing on not just the technical skills, but the values that made for true service. The Queen had mentioned the possibility of Thomas taking on a larger role in palace administration, using his unique perspective to help shape policy. Whatever path he chose, Thomas knew he wanted to continue the work of building a better, more humane institution. The confrontation had changed his life, but more importantly, it had given him a purpose beyond simply doing a job. The palace had become a place of hope rather than fear, a place where people felt valued and heard. The change was visible in countless small ways throughout each day. Servants greeted each other warmly in the corridors. Guards shared jokes and supported one another through difficult shifts. Administrators collaborated across departments that had once been isolated silos. The Queen walked among her staff with ease, no longer separated by walls of protocol and intimidation. Visitors to the palace commented on the positive atmosphere, the sense that this was an institution that had rediscovered its heart. Thomas watched all of this with quiet satisfaction, knowing that one moment of courage had sparked a transformation that would endure for years to come. 2 years after the confrontation that changed everything, Thomas stood in the Great Hall once again. But this time the circumstances could not have been more different. The palace was hosting a ceremony to honor long-serving staff members, and Thomas was being recognized not just for his years of service, but for his role in transforming the institution. He wore his dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, but he felt the same as he always had. Just a man trying to do the right thing. Around him were colleagues who had become friends, people who had joined him in the work of building something better. The hall was filled with warmth and genuine celebration, so different from the tense atmosphere of that fateful morning 2 years earlier. Queen Camilla took the podium to address the assembled staff, and her words reflected the journey they had all traveled together. She spoke about the importance of courage, not just the courage to face external threats, but the courage to confront our own failings and grow beyond them. She acknowledged that the palace had once been a place where fear overshadowed purpose, where people worked not from dedication, but from anxiety about punishment. She thanked Thomas specifically for having the strength to stand up when it mattered most, for refusing to accept treatment that diminished his humanity. Her voice carried genuine emotion, and many in the audience felt tears forming as they listened. The Queen announced that the committee Thomas had helped lead would become a permanent fixture of palace governance. With expanded powers and responsibilities, she revealed plans to create similar bodies in other royal households. Spreading the model of collaborative leadership that had proven so successful, she spoke about establishing a fellowship program that would bring young people from diverse backgrounds into palace service, ensuring that fresh perspectives and new ideas continued to flow into the institution. These were not just empty promises, but concrete commitments backed by funding and structural changes. The assembled staff erupted in applause, understanding that they were witnessing history being made. When Thomas was called forward to receive his recognition, he approached with his characteristic humility. The Queen presented him with a special commendation, but more meaningful than any medal was the handshake they shared. a reminder of that earlier handshake that had symbolized reconciliation and new beginnings. Thomas spoke briefly, his voice steady despite his nervousness. He emphasized that what had happened was not about one person standing up to authority, but about everyone in the palace rediscovering their shared humanity. He thanked his fellow guards, the servants, the administrators, everyone who had embraced change even when it was uncomfortable. He reminded them that maintaining what they had built would require ongoing effort and vigilance. After the ceremony, Thomas found himself surrounded by well-wishers, but he managed to slip away for a few moments of quiet reflection. He walked through the palace corridors, now familiar and welcoming rather than intimidating. He thought about his parents and wished they could have seen what their teachings had helped create. He understood now that his refusal to kneel had been about more than just that single moment. It had been about refusing to accept a world where people were valued based on their position rather than their character. It had been about insisting that dignity was not something that could be granted or taken away by others, but something inherent in every human being. The impact of the transformation continued to spread beyond the palace walls. Organizations around the world studied what had happened, looking for lessons they could apply in their own contexts. Universities invited Thomas to speak about leadership and ethics, though he always felt slightly ridiculous being treated as an expert when he had simply done what his conscience demanded. But he accepted these invitations because he understood the power of stories, the way personal examples could inspire others to find their own courage. He spoke honestly about his fears on that day, about the uncertainty that had followed, about the hard work required to turn a moment of confrontation into lasting change. Queen Camilla had become one of the most respected monarchs in the modern era, not through grand gestures or military victories, but through her willingness to change and grow. She had transformed what could have been a scandal into an opportunity for renewal. Her approval ratings remained high because people recognized that she had genuinely learned from her mistakes, that she had used her power to make things better, rather than simply to maintain control. She often spoke publicly about the incident with Thomas, not to praise herself for how she had responded, but to acknowledge how much she had needed to learn. Her honesty about her own failings made her more human, more relatable, and ultimately more effective as a leader. The relationship between Thomas and the Queen had settled into a comfortable friendship built on mutual respect. They still met regularly, sometimes formally as part of committee business, sometimes informally for conversations that ranged from palace matters to philosophy, to simply sharing stories about their lives. The Queen valued Thomas's perspective because she knew he would always tell her the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. Thomas appreciated that the Queen had not just apologized, but had fundamentally changed how she approached her role. They had both grown through their encounter, each learning from the other in ways that continued to shape their thinking and actions. As Thomas prepared to end his shift on the evening of the ceremony, he paused at his post one last time. He looked down the corridor where everything had begun, where he had made the choice that would alter the course of his life. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how a moment of weakness or fear could have led him to kneel, to accept humiliation, to remain silent. But he had not, and that choice had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. The palace was a better place now, and more importantly, the people who worked there felt valued and respected. That was worth any risk he had taken, any uncertainty he had endured. The story of Thomas and Queen Camilla would be told and retold for generations, becoming part of palace lore and national history. But for Thomas, the most important legacy was not the story itself, but the changes it had catalyzed. Young guards now joined the service knowing they would be treated fairly. Servants worked with dignity and pride. The palace had become what it should always have been, a place where tradition and progress coexisted, where authority was tempered by compassion, where every person mattered. As Thomas walked home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant colors, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so had helped create something better. That was enough. That was everything.